to be talking about the Dubai Declaration on Education and Climate Change, which is the result of a year-long project that we launched last year here in Dubai. We are the co-chairs of the Alliance, so Daniel Horn-Phathanothai is director of the World Resources Institute, which is one of the leading think tanks on climate change, leads the UK office. Very interesting about Leo, he is an author, has written a textbook on climate and development, and runs a project and funded a project, a children's project that includes a school in China, in the southern western border of China with Burma. So a lot of things about
Thank you,
Leo.
Sonia. I also wanted to introduce my wonderful co-chair for the Alliance, Sonia Medina. She's Executive Director for Climate Change at the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, which many of you will know is the world's largest private foundation dedicated to giving a brighter future for the world's children. And it's been a real privilege, Sonia, to have this opportunity to work with you. And really thrilled to have this chance today to share with you some of the key messages that have come out of the work of this Alliance. Before we go there, jump to the kind of the key messages from the Alliance, I just wanted to take a step back and share with you some of the rationale and the context for why is it that we are tackling these two momentous issues. You know, each of them on their own are gargantuan challenges, and we just thought, well, we'll address both of them together. But there's a good reason for that, and that's what I'm going to touch upon. By the way, as daunting as it is, you know, looking at this picture gives me a lot of hope, because if we can get a bunch of free-spirited children to do yoga like this in class, what can we not do? So I wanted to start by paying tribute to the late Stephen Hawking, a brilliant scientific mind, but also one of the greatest educators of our times. And he really exemplifies the ability to simplify and render accessible and engaging some of the most mind-bogglingly complex issues. And so he's we see him as very much a patron saint for our efforts. This quote of him I like a lot because it really establishes the rationale for why we're worrying about climate change issues in the context of education. Intelligence is the ability to adapt to change. And the problem we face is that the education that we have today, whether it's primary or secondary education, tertiary or adult learning, is only fractionally addresses the problem of climate change. More fundamentally, the way we construct knowledge and the way we pass on our understanding of the world and of our role in it, our place in it, is deeply limiting when it comes to our ability to address some of the fundamental and existential problems of climate change. So just a quick recap. I'm not going to go too much into the geeky science of it, but 2017 was a reminder that climate change is happening. The third hottest year on record after 2016 and 2015, the hottest non-El Nino year in 2017. So there's still people out there who doubt the reality and the threat of climate change, and I'd say that those climate deniers really stand as a case in point for the failure of the education system to impart basic understanding about the climate challenge. The point here is really that climate change is already transforming the world that we live in. Rising sea levels, widespread droughts, forest die-offs, the fires that we saw in California and in various parts of the world. The human geography that we live in is already being redrawn by the reality and the risks of climate. This is the floods last year in South Asia. Thousands killed, millions, over 40 million people's lives uprooted and disrupted, including educational, health systems, basic infrastructure disrupted by these historic floods. So a reminder of the direct impact that we're already seeing that's very much driven by the climatic changes. Likewise, we have a real ticking time bomb here. We've seen a massive very distinct uptake in instances of humanitarian crises on a scale that we have not seen since the wake of the Second World War. And what happens in these contexts when people's livelihoods, the very environments that they derive their livelihoods and their lives on, is being squeezed, people move. And what we're seeing now is the beginning of what promises to be a massive trend of human migration driven by environmental stresses, driven by climatic factors. So already today, we see the equivalent of 1 person per second moving away from their birthplace in search of a better life because their ability to eke a livelihood out of their environment has been compromised by extreme weather. What I've shown you so far is the evidence, the anecdotal or the impacts that we've already seen so far. If we project forward we're on track currently to see warming of about 4 degrees Celsius. The impacts of that will be, devastating beyond what I've just presented. Crop yields are going to be at the front line of the impacts of climate change. Some analysis has shown that about 10 million children in sub-Saharan Africa alone will be at risk of malnutrition as a result of the declines in crop productivity that are anticipated. UNICEF has put out a report also that shown that 1.5 billion children live in zones that will be compromised through flooding and droughts or other extreme weather events driven by climatic changes. And this really, the impact is going to be disproportionately severe on children. And a very stark number there is that 88% of the burden of global climate-related diseases falls on children under 5 years old. So a direct impact disrupting educational performance, educational attainment in schools. So climate change itself, the impacts of climate change directly transforming the world we live in. But equally important is the way that we're responding to these challenges is also transforming the world that the next generation and our generation will be growing up in. And the kind of the exam test for our alliance is really asking that question of how do we make people thrive and adapt in a world that's being transformed not just by climate change, but by our responses to it. So if you look at the major systems that our economies and societies that form the bedrock of how we live, eat, clothe ourselves, move about, all of that is going to have to fundamentally transform if we're going to have a chance of averting climate change. So if you talk about food and land, for example, we're going to have to move to fundamentally different forms of agriculture that are much less intensive in fossil fuel input, much kinder, gentler to the earth, that's much more effective at sucking the carbon out of the air and sequestering it in the soils. We're going to have transport systems that are much smarter, move away from individual kind of private cars to more transit-oriented development and electrification of mobility solutions. We need cities that are built with people in mind rather than, in many parts of the world today we have cities that are built with cars in mind. And so more compact cities, better connected cities around people's needs. And energy, we're already seeing a revolution in energy supply and connecting people in much smarter and much more efficient ways to renewable energy sources. But what all of this means is that the demands of the economy of the future are going to be drastically different from what the demands of the economy today. And we're churning out, our educational systems are churning out fodder for an old economy that is grinding to a halt. Whereas, there's a real risk of having a massive case of stranded human assets in that we're developing skills and curricula that are not answering the needs of the future economy that is, we already seeing signs, is already emerging. So this is just for a bit of background, and with that I want to hand over to you, Sonia, to say a bit about the work of the Alliance.
Yes, thank you. And we produced a small brochure, which I left at the beginning, so please do grab a copy as you walk out. So those are basically potentially the jobs of the future. And as a mother of two, I have a 4 and a 2-year-old. By 2050, we need to see a lot of these systems transform. It is really clear in my mind, is crystal what exactly I need to do to be part of the solution, and what is it as a mother I need to be bringing my children to understand so they can survive and really thrive in that new environment. So we set to work last year and the Alliance, where we said, what is the role of education in helping the world achieve this inclusive development while we combat climate change and other natural resources challenges? We know that obviously climate change is related to many difficult issues that we are facing in the world: water scarcity, food supply shortage, as Leo was referring to. But we know, for example, that air pollution is also the cause. Many of the sources of air pollution are also driving climate change. There is loss of biodiversity. So there is a number of natural challenges that we face, and all those come to the same type of development that we have been approaching and taking for granted over the last couple of centuries, really. So what are the questions that we pose ourselves to try to investigate? So why is climate change important to new education processes? What knowledge is important, and how we can effectively deliver knowledge and skills to learners and citizens to respond to this challenge? And how can education as a strategy can help us in our world of trying to mitigate climate change, address these issues? So this is the group that got last year. We had a number of photoshops into the picture because they had left the room by the time we got in. Maggie, who won last year, is part of the group, as is Walter, who is not there either, from Brazil, and Andrews. So these are all. Lisbeth, the head of the Education Commission. Lisbeth, Adriana from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the leader on education. Steve Robbenheimer, a development professional from South Africa. Miniya from India. Yuri from the OECD, Leo you've met, and Cynthia Schwartz from the UN. From the UN office. She worked as the communications officer, right hand to Ban Ki-moon, for 8 years while he was the Secretary General. So it's been a really interesting group that we got to work. So what is the context? You know this better than we do. Education is about enabling the human flourishing and the well-being through the development of an individual's intellect and talent, but really as part of a community. It's about for the furthering of humankind, if you wish. And as Leo has presented earlier, climate change is probably, if not the single biggest threat to the future of our kids and the present of our kids, definitely one that will potentially undermine their future very, very significantly. So we can't really be thinking about how we can enable human flourishing in the decades to come without seriously thinking the context in which we are going to be instructing and helping our children thrive in that environment. So when we put those two together, what are the combined challenges that we come up with? So how can education then contribute to that human flourishing in the context of a changed world, and one that is changing very, very rapidly? You would remember that it's only a few decades ago that we started to see real signals of temperature increases, and that is actually accelerating very, very rapidly. And something that the models have told us is that directionally the impacts of climate change are absolutely right. If anything, the models have been very conservative at predicting how quickly those impacts are being realized or becoming reality. So how can education then generate the knowledge, the skills, and very importantly for us in the Alliance this year, really cultivate the moral and intellectual virtues that are necessary to really create ecological citizens. We're calling it ecological citizens. Citizens that really understand what is their place in the world, you know, where it is not a full capitalism, full consumerism type of approach, but one that really understands the challenges that we are facing. And how can the education system as a whole respond to the challenge of climate change? What are the policies that are necessary? How can the systems be resilient to the absolute, the dramatic changes that our infrastructure is going to be facing? So, you know, many times when we have thought about climate change, and we face this all the time, climate change and development seems to be at odds all the time. But, you know, it will be better to be richer, and then we can address climate change. But actually, you know, they are deeply intertwined. That is a false choice, absolutely a false choice. And we actually know that climate change will disproportionately affect the most vulnerable populations, children around the world, and especially those in less economically developed countries, because those are societies that are still more reliant on agriculture, more reliant on jobs that are less part of the service economy, if you wish, and therefore are more subject to those stresses. So failure to address this, the climate change will put in jeopardy future development efforts going forward. So we think that development of the education systems in addressing climate change has a critical juncture in the next 15 to 20 years. It's absolutely, and Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General until last year, said it very well. This generation is the first one that can end poverty, and is the last generation that can really address climate change. It is as stark as that. So it is really incumbent upon us as parents, as educators, as development professionals to really take this very seriously, because it is not fair that our children are going to be passed on the hot potato to actually deal with a problem that they did not create. So the education sector, the education sector needs to be transformed in a way that really grabs this problem and turns around into what are the solutions? Where are the solutions? What are the new technologies? What are the new jobs? How do we transform it so we can actually accelerate that change? Because that transformation in our energy systems, that transformation of our systems, that transformation in our transport networks, that transformation in how we build cities, how we build infrastructure is on the way. It is undoubted that it is on the way. Question is it going to take us 50 years to get there? Is it going to take us 100 years to get there? Is it going to take us 200 years to get there? We will get there. There is going to be a massive difference to the children of this world, whether it takes us 50 years or 200 years. And the only way to accelerate us is that if the generation that is being educated today understands very, very clearly what it means to live in a climate transformed world and what it means to really address it and cut it through its roots. So education is paramount. Actually, it's paramount not only in addressing climate change, but really addressing every single sustainable development goal that the world has set itself to achieve. It is vital to deliver every single one of the improvements that we want to see in the children around the world. So these investments in education combine both the highest social returns, we have seen it over and over again, but also some of the most effective and low-cost options of addressing climate change. I want my kid to tell me when he grows up, I want to be a solar engineer. Or if he's a computer scientist, I want him to apply himself to actually achieve better optimized models to cut food waste across the agricultural system, or to come up with new agroforestry models that actually deliver both the nutrition that we need in a climate resilient way. I want him to be thinking about how do we can reduce the water consumption that is necessary to be generating energy around the world, how we can be communicating, etc., etc., etc. And those are the solutions, and these are the challenges that we want our kids to be thinking about when they set to think about where they want to be in the future. Because if they become coal plant power engineers, or they go and work in Volkswagens to deliver more internal combustion engines, or if he's going to be building the same cities that we live today, it's going to take 200 years to deliver the transformation that we need. And we don't have the time. We just don't. So expanding access to education, but the quality of that education, what is it that is in there and how it is delivered, it is the absolute crucial, and it must be retained at the top of the agenda, not only at the highest levels by head of states, but all the way down to head of schools, all the way down to teachers. It is not enough to explain simply what is the greenhouse effect and why climate is changing something. It is fundamentally to go all the way down to what are the solutions that implies. So what does that mean that education embraces climate action? So investing in education, as we have said, but expanding access to education needs to be really bringing that knowledge and skills together, and in understanding the climate challenge. But in really more importantly even, is what are the responses that are necessary, and so we can really survive and thrive in the world. Because climate change, as we have seen, the world has already warmed up by a degree, on average. What does that mean? Last year, the Arctic didn't freeze in summer. It was 25 degrees above average. We didn't think that we were going to see that in decades. The models told us that's a second half of the century problem. We saw it already last year. It is accelerating. You have to think about climate change as the Earth has a temperature. If your kid had fever and it's getting worse and you can't fix it, there has to be ways that we address the symptoms as well as we develop the solutions. So rethinking education in light of the climate challenge, obviously it raises profound challenges and demands to the system, to the content, how we deliver it, who needs to be there, who needs to be involved. Because, as we have said, those shocks and stresses from climate change will increase, and our education systems may not be able to cope as they are developed today. When you have 1.5 billion kids that live in potentially flooded areas, and they will be on the move, how do you keep teaching them? How do you, where will they go, and will we be able to absorb them? Or are they going to be another lost generation? Are we talking really about 1.5 billion kids that will not have access to education because we didn't think ahead? Is that really what we are thinking about? So, building that cohesion and stability, and building that resilience and that cooperation across the world is going to be absolutely necessary, because it's coming. And we shouldn't think, oh, I didn't know. No, we know. So let's think about it. So as the crisis intensifies, this is becoming increasingly urgent. It really is a question of the 10 to 20 years. So we came to think about what are the 5 principles that everyone needs to be thinking about when really setting itself to thinking about what is the curriculum that I need to develop for my school. Or if I'm a Minister of Education, what is the policies that I need to be set about? Or us, actually, as climate development professionals, it's like, how do I think about education? This has been absolutely a fascinating journey for me, because I have always come from a very climate perspective. And even though my sister is a teacher, I really had never embraced the education community in the way that I have been doing over the last year. So I have really opened my eyes in terms of the potential of bringing these two communities together to deliver a transformation that is really, could be really powerful and bring the prosperity that humankind deserves. So education is the responsibility of all. What does that mean? It's very obvious. it is not only obviously the responsibility of schools it is beyond that. It is all sectors of society. It's up to parents, it is up to communities, it's up to friends, it is up to about all sectors of society. So, you know, when we are talking about climate denialism, as Leo was saying, it is the failure of everybody in the community not having addressed that at its root, because we know it's politically motivated, we know it's economically motivated, and it has no reason to be there. So we need to be able to push back, not only from schools, but from absolutely everybody. And education in general, needs the long-term view. Principle number 2, global interdependence and the imperative of planetary stewardship provide the critical context for education in the 21st century. As we had said, climate, it's a relentless mega trend that is going to continue to increase. And we need to find what is the trade, global finance, migration policies, and education system policies that will really bring that together in order to address and really instill in our children those skills that will be necessary for them to succeed in the 21st century, which are beyond artificial intelligence and computer science and whatever. But how do these skills will be actually then deployed and used for the service of the community and for thriving in a system, in a world that is fundamentally transformed. So averting catastrophic climate change, number 3, calls for improved climate literacy of all, for all. We have reviewed a number of curriculum that have been put out there, UNESCO, many others, and they're just too basic. It is not enough that we dedicate the same amount of time explaining the greenhouse effect and climate change as we address the anatomy of a frog. I mean, it's just not possible. This is fundamentally, climate change is about absolutely everything. It's fundamentally about how we behave ourselves on a day-to-day basis, is how countries choose to develop. So it is a lot more fundamental than what we have been doing so far. So number 4, education needs to foster a sense of global citizenship and ecological responsibility in all. It is, and this is about the idea of these ecological citizens that we've been talking about, this moral sense of stewardship, of planetary boundaries, ecological stewardship. It's really important because otherwise we are really bringing our children up in an idea that more consumption is better. Perhaps more sustainable consumption is okay, one that is zero carbon, but we are not there yet. So any additional unit of consumption that it hasn't been thought about properly, it exacerbates the problem. As I landed this morning in Dubai, the text message I got on my phone is like, enjoy shopping in Dubai. I'm not shopping in Dubai. I'm not. I'm talking about something different. And it's like, it is absolutely everywhere. It's everywhere. 5, education reform and climate action should be pursued as mutually reinforcing objectives in public policy. It is obviously, there is a huge amount of work that we can do, and there is a lot that as educators we can achieve when we bring these principles really at the center of how we address, how we educate our children and as parents. But it's obviously really important that countries take it seriously, that ministers of education and ministers of environment get together and really develop public policy that is mutually reinforcing. So it gives the resources that are needed and develop the curriculum that today doesn't exist. It's just not there to be able to develop a generation that can be truly ecological citizens, that understand the global interdependence that we have in the world and can really survive and thrive in the challenges of the 21st century. So this year, 2018, we are going to get going with the action agenda. So we got to develop the principles this year. 2018 is about the action agenda, which we are going to be developing in consultation with key stakeholders, and we will present at this very place next year. Hope to see you here next year. If you want to be involved or you know people that should be consulted, please let us know. You have some more information about what we have done so far, and the brochures at the front, as I said. But if you or anyone that you know would like to be part of this group momentum, building the action agenda, please do let us know. Leo and I will be delighted to be working with you on it. And that's what we had for you today. Thank you.
Thank you.
2 minutes if you have any questions.
So can I
Arturo.
ask/suggest on, because I read the guidelines, and I don't want to be over dramatic, but this, you said it, the last generation that can do something, but that's referring to ours, really, not so much as the kids who are entering school today. I mean, as in the plenary was mentioned, somebody who is 4 now, and let's say go over K to 12 and then college, in 18 to 20 years, they will be out to the labor force, let's say, the professional labor force. And that will be 2040. And so they can change and shift and consumption patterns and habits, etc. But their effect is likely to be much smaller than our generation's effect if we really get together and do something. But they will have to face adaptation to what's already irreversible about climate change. And I didn't see that there, maybe didn't see it explicitly. I lead, as you know, Sonia, a rural university on agriculture, and we're working hard on, we have worked hard on this, but now we're starting to work hard on the next. How crop management is going to change, has to change to uncertain conditions, because we know some of it. First of all, we know a range, but then we don't know what everything else around the soil will change. We know about the air somewhat with temperature, but then humidity, salinity, all minerals in the soil, et cetera, and interactions that we cannot completely foresee because these are complex systems. Now, I'm only saying that these kids, the ones who are entering school today at 4, they're going to be in 2040, and that will see already a change beyond what we've seen these last hot years. And acknowledging that it's not a certain science, like we don't know for sure what's going to be, but we need to prepare them for that in all areas of everything, production and culture, and habitats are going to change, and living spaces we have to change, etc. So just pointing to that adaptation part. I mean, climate change, the slowing down is not over by any means. But we also need to start preparing for the adaptation phase. That's all.
Yeah, so absolutely. And I guess that we should have made it explicit. That's what we meant by surviving and thriving, in the understanding what is coming, and then how can you turn it. Something that's sometimes is not obvious when the climate community talks about mitigation efforts and why they are important, is because for us to even, so at the moment we have warmed up about a degree, and the scenarios are that we will continue to increase to 3, 4, whatever, unless we actually put a cap, right? And we're saying maybe if we are able to stop at 1.5 or 2, we may avert the worst impacts of climate change. It still will be very bad, and we need to adapt to that warm-up wall of 1.5 or 2 degrees. And we already live in a world that has warmed up a degree. And we have seen the increase of floods and the increase of hurricanes and the increase of people moving. So all that we need to adapt, and to much worse, because the world right now, the inertia that we have is that we are saying we will accept that and much worse. This is what we are saying, the international community. Right, what people don't sometimes fail to understand, actually it wasn't clear to me until very recently, is that unless we actually implement all those solutions and we go into a zero carbon world, the trend of increase continues. Right. So we could, continues. So it's like to 4, 5, 6, 7. It's like we can't. There is no way on Earth to stop the increase of emissions, and unless we go into zero carbon, unless we disappear. Or there are people. As I was coming into Dubai, I watched this movie called Geostorm. And Geostorm is about geoengineering, and it's the idea of that humanity actually starts developing a constellation of satellites that actually know how to control weather, because weather has become so unpredictable that you can't. Now, you think that may be science fiction, right? But this year, for the very first time, there is going to be the first experiment in the desert of Arizona of starting to put stuff into the atmosphere that will reflect solar radiation back into space, so it doesn't warm up the atmosphere. So there is already groups of people out there trying to figure out how to get radiation out. That doesn't address any of the sources of CO2 and greenhouse gases around the world at all, right? So we need to go into zero carbon in order to stop. How fast we get there will tell us how much of an adaptation challenge we have in front of us. Whether it's something that we could, perhaps within there, it will be understandable, or will be a challenge that is so massive that will require a complete rethink of agricultural systems or cities or whatever. I don't know, Leigh, if you wanted to add anything.
No, I mean, very much agree that, when we're looking at the exam question we asked ourselves is how, exactly as Sonia was saying, how do we ensure that this generation and the next can not just adapt to, but thrive, right, in a world that's being transformed by the impacts of climate change, that a lot of which, as you say, are already baked in, but also being transformed by the solutions that we're bringing to it, right? So we want to make sure that that these kids, we need to be thinking now about the kinds of skills that they are going to acquire in a learning environment in order to be able to be useful to this new economy that is already emerging, right? So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is that when we talk about education, I think one of our principles is that it is, we don't think about it just in terms of primary or secondary, nor even tertiary, but we're talking about education across the continuum. So there's part of the challenge of education will be about reskilling people who are going to be affected and stranded in the transition, away from coal. That has driven a lot of the toxic politics in places like, the coal belt in the United States. And so the people who are being left behind in this transition, right, as we are rushing towards a low carbon green economy, we need to make sure that that our education system adapts to be able to include people who are being left out because their skills, their very specific skills, are no longer relevant. So we really, what we're trying to bring is very much a holistic understanding of not just how education can help equip better leaders for addressing climate challenge in the future, but very much how the education system, and it's not just the content of education, it's also the infrastructure that supports the delivery of quality education services. How is that going to be impacted by climate change, right? So the issue that Sonia mentioned about 1.5 billion children who live in zones that are going to be rendered, for all intents and purposes, inhabitable, right? They're going to be on the move. How do we make sure that educational systems are set up to be able to absorb and absorb those additional people and address their needs? That's very much part of the adaptation issue that we need to anticipate that with the climate change that's already baked in, there are going to be disruptions that we need to be equipped to address. So, but that's a very good point, and I guess we should maybe make that more
part
explicit.
Of the action agenda. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for that, Arturo. Any other questions? Yes, gentleman over here.
Thanks for your presentation. My name is Busani Bafana. I wanted to find out, talking about climate change education targeting the children, how many schools have you actually put under your project, and where are they? Do you have any in Africa? And how are you dealing with the current policy? Because I know, like, from my country, Zimbabwe, I don't think climate change is on the curricula. So how do you actually bring this in?
Can you repeat where you're
from Zimbabwe?
From Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
And you're in the educational, are you?
I'm a journalist. I'm a development journalist, yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. Beautiful. Well, so we're currently at very much at the 30,000 foot level in terms of trying to articulate the intersection of these two agendas and what is the action agenda at the intersection of these two issues, right? These two challenges. In answer to your question, we haven't engaged directly in schools, although we have people in our alliance who are teachers or involved in the delivery of educational services. For the next stage, I think it will be really important for us to be speaking with people who are at the front line of delivering education services in places like Africa and all around. We want to be open-minded and inclusive in terms of getting voices and input from people all around the world as we develop the action agenda. So if you have any suggestions or recommendations, we would be very, very open and receptive to them.
Absolutely.
Hi, my name is Zuzana Labashova from Slovakia, and I'm part of an organization that does environmental and ethical education in our country. So I'm kind of the front line.
Excellent.
And the greatest challenge for me when dealing with kids and even adults, and I'm maybe asking for some kind of hint from you, is that we're living in a world where, at least in our country, the climate change is not very visible for the regular average person. And we're still very much surrounded by a consumeristic society. And so then we come into this context and tell them about all the things that are happening that are kind of sci-fi for them, and which is a very big challenge, because we're talking about things that are happening, but they're not seeing it. So maybe any hints or ideas about how to make those actual things visible so that they can actually are tangible for the kids and the adults, because they're living in a very different bubble right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is, to be honest, that's one of the key, you nail it on the head. The climate community has been facing that communications challenge for decades. And until recently, our ability to communicate with head of states or with leaders was sufficient by presenting the science behind it and the recommendations at the policy level. But we didn't really need to go down to the communications of, like, what does that mean at the individual level? What does that mean for the kids, right? So there were some examples, but they were very much like the biodiversity on your area, perhaps, or your or around the world. But it is undoubted that we actually need to get a lot smarter at doing that. Air pollution is a way of getting to some of this, making it a lot more visible. So without talking about climate change, air pollution is something that affects absolutely every single city around the world. There is not a single city in the world that has clean air. And clean air affects absolutely everything. Educational performance in a school, kids missing school days in India, for example, because of bad air days, and they have to be closed down, or asthma attacks, or it's like even cancer. It is now being linked to premature babies, and low birth weight is being linked to cognitive development being undermined, connected to Alzheimer, etc. So when you start connecting a lot of what's air pollution derives into health impacts for children and their adults and more vulnerable populations like the elderly, to start creating a narrative that says, like, why are we breathing air that is killing us? Why are we breathing air that is not clean? And then you can extend to water challenges. I mean, like or depending on what they care about. For example, in India, the tiger is being completely decimated across the forest because of mining in the area. It's a question of understanding a little bit what are the challenges in the. We don't need to be talking about climate, and I think this is what we are starting to realize more and more. There is many of these natural challenges. They're all interconnected, and they all come from that approach that society has taken in terms of our development. Plastics in the ocean, if that's something that your community really feels motivated by, there is more plastic in the ocean than fish in the sea by body mass. It is absolutely outrageous that we are not demonstrating on the street and says, like, we are going to ban every single one-use plastic that we use around the street. It's like there is plastic in the ocean that's outweighs right now the fish. It's insane.
Maybe just a couple comments on that. One is that what people care about above anything else is their children, right? So I think the entry point of what the future will look like, and that that children need to be prepared and equipped to be able to thrive in, that would be kind of one entry point that I would suggest. The other, of course, is you know, to bring it back to the nexus of issues that actually impinge directly on what people care about, whether it's security, you know, migration, jobs, prosperity in the end of the day, right? So air pollution is a big driver, for example, in China. You know, awareness, you know, even though the Chinese government is very ambitious and very showing strong leadership on climate, a recent survey showed that only 19% of people polled in China believe that climate change is a serious issue, right? However, everybody thinks that air quality is a huge issue because it directly impacts the air and the health of the children, right? The air that the children breathe. So that's an entry point for tackling climate issues in a place like China. But I also wanted to kind of take your question in another direction, which is that I think we, this community that I'm a part of, have been part of the problem, and because we have set climate up as a very niche specialist issue that only experts can understand, and we've kind of in so doing disengaged and de-responsibilized the public, you know. So I think our principle number one, education is a responsibility of all. And the other principle about a global ethic of responsibility that needs to underpin the way we think about education is absolutely fundamental. It should no longer be in the future that climate experts even exist. Everybody should be aware and intelligent about climate change in the areas in the professions and in the areas of scientific inquiry that they kind of lead. So we need to take climate out of the scientific silo that it had been slotted into, and really plug it into the mainstream of how we think about infrastructure, how we think about energy, how we think about how we build cities, how we think about farming, etc. So that's part of the challenge. It really is rewiring the way that knowledge about climate is generated, so that it's interdisciplinary. It's not just from the scientific community, and rewiring the way that knowledge is then delivered to different professions and different sector experts, so that it becomes embedded in the way that we act on a whole range of issues, rather than being kind of a little community kind of making a lot of noise and then being kind of swept to one side because the connection isn't that clear. So it really is a challenge for our community.
So we have run out of time, but there is a question. So can we address it quickly, or do we have a couple of minutes?
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. It's just one comment, just to complement what you said, and even as you move forward, I think we need to unpack the buzzword, even as we look at what action do we need to take, so that even the child in a kindergarten will see herself as part of the solution.
Yes.
But as long as we start bringing climate change and all that,
Yes.
it becomes too scientific. And yet there are simple actions that even as little as my 2-year granddaughter would also act to make a difference. I thought I should emphasize that. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
yeah.
No, absolutely.
Very good
So
point.
my 4-year-old talks about clean air and the difference between walking, taking the bus, or actually going on my car. So absolutely, I completely agree with that. So thank you so much for bearing with us for 45 minutes. Please spread the word. Dubai Declaration on Education and Climate. You are our first set of ambassadors. Please spread the word. Thank you so much.
Thank you.